All right, well, welcome to my session on planning a Microsoft Fabric environment. By way of introduction, I am the principal consultant for data at DACO, and we are an Australian-based consultancy in the data and AI space. I'm the founding organizer of the Queensland Power BI and Fabric user group. I'm a 7-time Microsoft MVP awardee, and I've been working with Microsoft BI and analytics for over 25 years. So let's talk about why are we here, and what is the session going to cover. So creating most artifacts within Fabric or Power BI is relatively quite easy, and once you've learned how to do it, it's not that hard. And that is true, but managing and disseminating content within Fabric or Power BI is not always easy. Properly managing security is a challenge. Ensuring consistent and an enjoyable user experience is also not always easy. Excuse me. And ensuring proper governance actually requires a plan from your organization. So the discussion points today are, we're going to be talking about licensing, data connectivity and storage, effective use of workspaces, security considerations, and content management. I'll not be discussing any of these topics in great detail, but hope to leave you with an idea of some of the things that you need to think about for an enterprise deployment. Everything I discussed today is also based on current public information. So some of the statements that I make in this presentation may actually change tomorrow if Microsoft releases new functionality that changes the way you'd approach something. And that certainly has happened a lot over the years of Power BI's life, where the way that we did something changed because of a new feature. And that's generally very good when that happens, but it is something to keep in mind. And very importantly, decisions made in one area may impact or limit the choices that you're going to have in other areas, like decisions you make around how security needs to work within your organization will have a bearing on how you structure your workspaces, as an example. And so having a holistic understanding is key to being able to design a good strategy. Also, what I need to point out is that there are definitely gray areas in this, and the solution for one company will not necessarily be the right solution for another company. And there will also be different opinions. So hopefully you'll just get a feeling for what is important for you to consider when you're planning your Fabric or Power BI environment. So I'm sure by now all of you are sick of Fabric. We've been talking about it all day. You all know exactly what Fabric is. But I think the thing that I need to point out when we're talking about this is for those who have been on a Power BI journey and are now starting to consider using Microsoft Fabric, the good news is that at the top level, the security and things like that typically work like Power BI did. A lot of your security is tied to the workspace, and the workspace is still the sort of containment boundary like it has always been within Power BI. So that's important to be aware of if you're new to Fabric. And also an important question in looking at what we're going to be talking about tonight that you need to ask yourself is, do we just need Power BI or do we need the new Fabric capabilities as well? Because if all you're after is what you get with Power BI today, then the way that you license that could potentially be different to how you would license it if you're actually looking for the Fabric capabilities as well. So let's kick straight into licensing and discussions around capacity, okay? So the things that you need to consider around licensing is, as I've already mentioned, will you be using Fabric items or only Power BI items? How many end users or consumers will we have in our organization? How many content creators will we have? How big will our data be? And how real-time do our reports need to be? These are all things, factors that influence licensing discussions. So let's look at licenses. We're going to look at Power BI Pro, Premium per user, and then Fabric capacities. And now immediately, I'm sure some of you are wondering, well, where's Power BI premium capacity? Well, if you're using premium capacity today, these are being phased out. In fact, I don't believe you can even buy premium capacity anymore. You would just buy Fabric capacity, and any existing premium capacities within the next 12 months are going to be phased out and replaced automatically in the background for you with Fabric capacities. So let's look at Power BI Pro. Okay, so this is your entry-level license for production purposes. It is generally, well, not generally, it is priced per user or charged per user. And it currently is sitting at $10 per month. And it has been at that price point for many, many years, which is quite impressive that they've managed to keep it at that price point for so long. And this allows you to create and share reports, semantic models, data flows, scorecards, paginated reports, and dashboards. Please don't use dashboards. And you can secure your Power BI content or your BI content. So, Power BI Pro allows you all of the security features that you would expect around managing which users can access what. And, as long as you're doing the right thing as the people managing that content, it'll all be very secure. And you can connect to on-premise and cloud data sources using Power BI Pro. You can set up subscriptions and alerts. And you can schedule refreshes of your semantic models. Each semantic model can be refreshed 8 times per day per data set. And that is one of the limitations of Power BI Pro that often drives organizations to consider going up to the higher license arrangements. Other limitations that you should be aware of is that your dataset / semantic models are limited to 1 gigabyte each in size. Now, this is the in-memory VertiPack engine, so it's not 1 gigabyte of data. The data typically compresses very well, and 1 gigabyte in the VertiPack engine can often be representative of up to 8 or even 10 gigabytes on disk. So it is actually quite a lot of data that you can fit into a semantic model under 1 gigabyte. And then total storage for your organization or for your Power BI tenancy is limited to 10 gigabytes per user. So if you've got 10 users, the total storage that you're allowed is 100 gigabytes as an organization. There's no incremental refresh, and it becomes expensive with many hundreds of users. And there are other limitations that you need to be aware of, but the ones that I've listed here are typically the ones that have the biggest impact on organizations. Okay, so Power BI Premium per user is the next level up. So this was created in order for small to medium-sized enterprises to get the power of what Power BI Premium / Fabric now, well, what Power BI Premium previously offered, but at a per user price level. So this, as you can see, is double the price of Power BI Pro at $20 per month. But data sets can suddenly go from 1 gigabyte to 100 gigabytes. So that's a massive increase. And scheduled refreshes can now be performed 48 times per day per data set. It also offers better performance than Pro. This is hard to quantify, but certainly I know that the people I speak to who have moved from Pro to Premium per user have noted somewhere between slight and significant improvements in performance. And I think it's one of those it depends things on what you're doing. And it also enables some advanced AI and reporting features that are only available to Premium. And hybrid tables is another big feature that you get with Power BI Premium per user. All right, so I'll now move on to discussing Fabric capacities. So Fabric capacities introduced the new Fabric items, so we're talking about lake houses, warehouses, event houses, notebooks, data factory, and more. And for anyone who's been hanging around this conference today, I'm sure you know all the things that I'm talking about because you would have seen it on several different presentations. Now, the way that these are purchased is by purchasing what we call an F SKU. This is done in the Azure portal, and you can purchase anything ranging from an F2 at the smaller size to an F2048 at the top end of the scale. Now, this is very different to how Power BI Premium was priced before, or quite different to how to most other data platforms out there today. Because you basically buy the concept, depending on the SKU you get a certain amount of capacity units. And this is, in a way, a simplified way to think about it is capacity units buy you a certain amount of compute power per minute, per second, per day, okay? And one of the things that we'll also talk about is smoothing and bursting. Now, this is a very unique sort of capability that Microsoft has brought for Fabric. If, let's say, you've purchased an F16 SKU, which is still quite small, but you have one or two hours in the day where you actually need to run some big, massive workloads, maybe an overnight load of your data warehouse or something like that. Microsoft actually allows you to consume more capacity units per second than you're entitled to, as long as they can effectively get that back from you at a later date. And I will explain this further in a slide further down the line. So before we move on to bursting and smoothing, let's have a look at Fabric's pricing. Now, what you'll notice is there's two columns here, which is one is for the pay-as-you-go, and the other one is for reservation pricing. Now, in monthly, what they mean is this is what you pay per month. But with reservation, you're getting close on a 41% reduction in cost, but you are making an annual commitment to using Fabric. So you're getting the discount for making that commitment. Okay. All these prices are obviously in US dollars for simplicity. But you'll notice that I highlighted the F64 SKU, and that is because for several different reasons. So first of all, the F64 is what Microsoft considers to be equivalent to previous premium capacity. So some of the things that you only got with premium capacity, you only get when you get to the F64 level. Probably the most significant of those are the free consumers. So for those who have been around Power BI for a while, you'll know that with Pro, it was per user licensing. When you got Premium, the end consumers effectively were free. You could have as many as you liked on your capacity as long as the capacity could handle the workload. With F SKUs up to F32, you don't get free consumers. Every consumer and every content creator needs to have a Power BI Pro license as well as you having the Fabric capacity. By buying the Fabric capacity in that instance, you're effectively just buying the additional features that come with Fabric, like lake houses and warehouses and event streams and all of this new functionality. You're also buying the ability to do bigger data sets, have more frequent refreshes and that sort of thing that you get with Fabric. But talking about the F64, that is the important mark to note where your consumers start becoming free. So if you're currently a Power BI Premium customer with a P1 capacity, Microsoft is going to convert that to an F64 for you when the transition happens. There's also one or two advanced features that only become available at F64. A good thing is that Microsoft has reduced the number of those in the last couple of months. But probably the biggest one that everyone's becoming aware of that you only get at F64 is a lot of the Copilot functionality within Fabric only kicks in if you have a F64 or above capacity. So that is something quite important to be aware of. I see we have a hand up. Do you want to come off mute and ask your question? Actually, I think the organizers have made it so people can't come off mute at the moment. Maybe write your question in the chat and I will try and get to answer all of those questions once I'm done with my presentation. Thank you. All right. So now let's look at bursting and smoothing. So this GIF is trying to do a good job of explaining how bursting and smoothing happens. So with these large jobs, as you can see, they were happening for a short, intense period of time. And essentially what Microsoft is doing is they are smoothing, they're bursting, so they're allowing you to use more than you've purchased at the time. But then they smooth it over the period. Now, this can get very technical, but for background operations, which typically are going to be the bigger operations, that they give you they're smoothed over a 24-hour period, as that image right there shows. And so effectively, it's my way of explaining it, and this may not match with Microsoft, but it's like when you're bursting, you're getting a loan that you have to pay back. And so you're effectively paying it back over the next 24 hours. And as long as your total consumption over those 24 hours doesn't exceed the capacity units that you've purchased, you won't get any bill shock. But it is important to be aware that Microsoft is doing this, because if you suddenly increase your usage significantly, they could send you an additional bill if your overall usage in a 24-hour period has exceeded what you've purchased. All right. So when we talk about the licenses and capacities, how do you go about deciding what your organization needs? So, and this is my opinion, but I think Fabric capacities are now the default, unless you already have a fully functioning data platform. So in other words, you already have a data warehouse, maybe you've got Snowflake or Azure Synapse Analytics or Databricks, and it's fully functional. You've made a massive investment in it and you're just looking for reporting. So that's where you would look at maybe Power BI Pro or Premium per user, depending on your user counts. Or a situation in which you only need the Power BI items. In that case, decide between Pro and Premium per user based on their relative capabilities. Or if your user base is sufficiently large where the sum of the user licenses gets to the point where it's larger than it would cost you to purchase an F64. And then size your Fabric SKU based on, there's many things to consider, but probably the top three things to consider are number of users, the anticipated workloads, and the frequency and size of data movements. All right, let's talk about data connectivity and storage. So semantic model modes within Power BI and Fabric are really important to understand in deciding how you're going to use Fabric for your organization. So import mode has, for as long as Power BI has been around, been the default mode, and in most situations, the most desirable mode. So yeah, your sources can be on-premise or cloud, and process data, and as the name suggests, the data is actually imported into the semantic model. So if you're pointing at a data warehouse, a copy of that data is being brought into Fabric/Power BI and persisted within the semantic model. Import mode gives you the most functionality and the best performance, but its limitation is that, as you saw with Power BI Pro, you can only refresh 8 times a day. So you end up potentially with stale data when you're using import mode. It's only updated every time you refresh the semantic model. The other mode that Power BI released with, or right from the get-go, is direct query. And this is, the data is not persisted in the semantic model. Every time somebody interacts with that semantic model and issues a query to it, or works on a report that is linked to that semantic model, it's issuing queries back down to the original data source. So think of this: if you've got a semantic model over a SQL Server database, every time a user changes a filter or slices something or moves to a new page, it's actually issuing SQL queries to that source. Now, the obvious benefit to that is as soon as the data is updated in your source, it can be reflected in the report. So you get pretty much real-time reporting capabilities with direct query. The massive downside is that its performance is then tied to how quickly those SQL queries are performing. Import mode is by massive orders of magnitude faster than direct query, and so the user experience with direct query is not always very good. But later Microsoft then introduced the composite models that were trying to give us the best of both worlds. So this allows you to mix imports in direct query mode. So a lot of your tables are not being updated every few seconds. Think about dimension tables. Maybe you've got transactional tables that are, daily snapshots, and then you've got one or two transactional tables that actually are being updated every few seconds. You can actually get the best of both worlds, where those tables that don't need it can be in import mode, and only one or two or three or however many unique tables that do need real-time updates can be in direct query mode. This also allows you to integrate multiple direct query data sources, so using more than one source. Then Microsoft introduced hybrid tables, and these are fact tables that have multiple import partitions and one direct query partition. So they are import except for the most recent partition within the fact table. And this went a long way to solving solving for that real-time requirement while still getting pretty damn good performance. So hybrid tables are a very good consideration if you're dealing with large volumes of data and you require near real-time reporting capabilities. However, that is what you've got with Power BI today. With the advent of Fabric, they've now added a new mode called Direct Lake. So as I said, that only works with Fabric capacities. And what this does is it directly connects the Power BI semantic model to OneLake. And so essentially, the refresh itself doesn't need to import any more data. So it's completely different to import mode. But because of the advancements in technology in OneLake and the way that they've built Direct Lake, the performance is actually very similar to import mode. And so changes at the OneLake data level can immediately reflect in the reports. And therefore, you're basically getting, you're getting almost the best of both worlds. You're getting import mode like performance, but with the benefits of Direct Query. So in other words, as soon as a record is updated in your OneLake storage, whether being a table in a lakehouse or a table in a warehouse, it doesn't matter. That can reflect immediately within the semantic models. I will point out that if that sounds really exciting to you, Direct Lake is very impressive, but I will point out that today it still has some limitations compared to the import mode. So please research those if you're intending to go out and start using Direct Lake after this presentation. All right, so let's talk about workspaces and apps. Now, Power BI, if we look at this graphic, which is from Microsoft around, typically how workspaces are used. So Power BI Desktop is the primary content creation tool. That's obviously slowly changing as they release more and more capability within the browser. But I think most serious development shops that are doing Power BI development today are still using Desktop as the primary content creation tool. And then workspaces are the area where content creators and admins collaborate to finalize the data assets, whether that be semantic models, reports, etc. And then you publish an app from that workspace. And this is really what the end users should be interacting with. If you've set your organization up properly, none of your end users should even know that the workspace exists. They just interact with apps. Okay? As we stand today, a workspace can only have one app associated with it, which sounds quite limiting, but luckily Microsoft released a feature that allows for multiple different audiences within the app. And that allows you to separate, maybe you have a large workspace that's got quite a lot of content in it, and maybe there's 3 different user bases that all need some reports for this user base and other reports for that user base, and they're all in the same workspace. You can still publish an app and selectively make those reports available to different audiences. Okay. So how to structure your workspaces is an organizational decision. And I will point out that this is typically one of the hardest ones for organizations to get right. And a lot of discussion goes into this. And what actually originally prompted me to put this presentation together was how many customers I saw that went out there and just started creating workspaces willy-nilly without giving it any forethought, and then realizing 6, 12, 18 months later what a mess they had within their Power BI environment. So I strongly advise that you do spend a lot of time thinking about how you're going to structure your workspaces, and some of the things that we're still yet to discuss today have a bearing on how you structure your workspaces. So some of the things you've got to consider is how do you structure your workspaces around, like, is it departmental or business unit based? So do you have sales workspaces? Do you have operations? Do you have HR? Do you have finance? How are you going to structure that? There's several different approaches, which are a significant conversation in their own right. But these are the things you got to think about. How are you going to structure that? And how will security work, or how does security impact that? Because it's great to say, hey, we're going to have a sales workspace. But if within the sales department, there's different audiences that should have access to different things, that might actually have an impact on how you structure those workspaces. As I've previously mentioned, with things like apps and multiple audiences within the apps, you can circumvent some of those challenges, but it's not impossible for you to still end up with a security headache because of the way that you've decided to structure your workspaces. So these are the things that you need to consider. And then you also need to think about external sharing. There's various different ways to externally share your content, using things like Power BI Embedded or using Publish to Web. And all of these things will have a bearing on how you structure your workspaces and the content within those. Right, let's have a look at security considerations. So if we look at user security, so this is integrated with Entra ID. So security within Power BI fully leverages the single sign-on experience we have with Microsoft Work accounts, and uses the same pattern that pretty much everything else Microsoft uses as well. At a workspace level, you can set access at there's 4 different roles that you can set or give to a person. So probably got these slightly the wrong way around, but you've got a contributor who is somebody who can help or work on the content within a workspace. So they can create semantic models, reports, all of these things. They can set settings or most settings on those things. So they can set up the schedule refresh. They can, set endorsement levels, and that if they've been given permission to do so. But they essentially are there to contribute towards the content within the workspace. Members can do everything contributors can. In addition, they can also manage security of the workspace. So a contributor can't add somebody else in the organization to that workspace, whereas a member can. A member can manage the security assigned to that workspace. And then at the top level, we've got the admin. The admin account can do everything a member can do, as well as some administrative jobs, as you would imagine. And importantly, an admin can also actually delete a workspace. So an admin can do whatever you can think is possible within a workspace. And then we got viewers. Now, viewer accounts, as the name says, are people who will then be able to go to the workspace and look at the content in there, but they can't make any changes to content. So they can effectively use reports, run the report. They'll be able to see what's in the workspace, but and with things like Fabric now, if they've been given enough permission, viewers can also go and query, like the lake houses. They can run SQL queries and that sort of thing, but they can't change anything. And then when we look at the app, which is, just to reiterate, the app is actually where the end users should be going. You can set with the different multiple audiences, which I mentioned before. For each audience, you can set who has access to that audience. So if, for instance, your workspace, you had 4 different audiences for that app, you set up the 4 different audiences, you set up what the content they've got access to, and then by giving permissions to the different audiences will impact what the user sees when they go into the app. So it's not, once you move to an audience-based security, it doesn't mean that a person could only have access to one of the 4 audiences. You can actually give them access to multiple, and they'll only see the audiences that they're allowed to see. All right. I am conscious that it doesn't seem like anyone can ask questions verbally, and I can't see the chat while I'm doing this. So what I will do is I'll get through my presentation, and because there's no questions being asked, I'll do so a little bit earlier than expected, and I will take a bunch of questions at the end. All right. So let's talk about environments. Dev, test, prod, you may have 4 or 5 different environments in your organization, but I think most people know what I'm talking about. Yeah. Within Fabric, you can implement many different combinations of workspaces and apps, and your organization needs to decide what works for you. So if we look at typical implementations of dev, test, prod, now option 1, which is the really straightforward one, and I'd hope to not see this at any kind of large scale organization, but this is where you essentially have a single workspace for a domain. So a data modeler would work, and report designer would work in Power BI Desktop. They would publish their content to the workspace, which essentially is being considered to be development and test, because you would actually get the people who need to test to connect to the workspace and test within the workspace. Possibly they only have viewer roles. That's what I'd hope in this situation. And then you would publish an app which is considered to be production. So the app becomes production, and you have view-only users connected to that. Now, like I said, this scenario, this approach to doing dev, test, prod, to me is valid only in a few circumstances. The one being either a very small organization or very small teams, where having the formality of having different workspaces represent different environments is essentially considered to be just too much red tape for almost no gain. I do see that, as I said, typically with SME organizations, And even with medium-sized organizations, I'd say the smaller medium-sized organizations. You may have this for project-based work. So let's say your organization is quite mature around your CI/CD, but you're standing up a very specific project within the organization that has a defined timeline, defined life. That's another reason you may decide that you don't want to introduce a lot of red tape into the project. So you create a workspace for the project and people work within that for that purpose. Or maybe you're using it specifically for external sharing, in which case you may decide as an organization that, again, you don't want to take the effort that goes with proper dev test prod and do it that way. But by far the most the approach that you should be taking within Power BI or Fabric today is the use of deployment pipelines. I will point out that deployment pipelines do not exist or do not work for Power BI Pro. This is a premium per user or Fabric capacity capability. So yeah, you can see just a screenshot of what it looks like when you create a deployment pipeline. This one's just been created, not much has been done to it. But what this allows you to do is to assign different workspaces to the different stages. So you can see in that screenshot, it's asking you to choose a workspace to assign to that stage. So essentially, if you had dev test prod, and for a particular domain, you'd have 3 workspaces. There's caveats to that around data sets or data only workspaces. I don't get into detail on that today, but it is something to be aware of, that there's various different combinations that could happen here. But deployment pipelines, once you've assigned the workspaces to them, essentially allow for deployment from one stage to another. It does a comparison for you. It tells you what's different. And then you can selectively deploy items. So if you can imagine a situation in which you have a workspace where 4 different developers are working on 4 different reports, and one of them is ready to deploy their report to test. You don't have to deploy the other 3 that are still work in progress to test. You can choose which items you want to deploy from dev to test and from test to production even. You can combine this with Get integration. I typically would only do that in dev. I would not Get integrate test and production. And if you follow Microsoft's best practices around analytics lifecycle management, this is what they recommend, is that you put Get integration on dev. That allows you to save and commit your changes to a Git repo, which is industry best practice. But then you use the deployment pipelines to deploy from environment to environment. All right, let's start talking about content management. So, the question is, who creates content? Now, traditionally, it's been what we call corporate BI, where developers create and deliver the content. So you've got a BI development team in the organization. They handle everything from preparing the data to doing the semantic modeling to creating reports, and they deliver that, and the rest of the organization simply uses those reports. They're not doing any of their own development, okay? Then we've got what we call governed or IT managed self-service BI, and this is where IT, when I say IT, again, a BI development team or something like that, would develop and control the data aspect of things. So they will make sure that the data gets prepared, whether they need lake houses or warehouses or all the other Fabric items for that or not. But essentially, at the end, they're presenting a set of well-managed and controlled semantic models for the rest of the business to actually use to create their reports off of. And then the other approach, which is what I like to refer to as the Wild West, is where you just let everyone do whatever they want. The business units are provided workspaces, and you kind of IT has a completely hands-off approach, and they go, well, you got a workspace, go for your life, do whatever you like. So all three of these have merits. Traditionally in BI, we've done the corporate BI approach, and while it's great for governance, it is a major bottleneck for the business to get what they need. And it was not uncommon, and still isn't uncommon, for me to go into customers and I speak to a business user like an accountant or someone like that, and they say, I've been waiting for my report for 2.5, 3 months. That is what happens with corporate BI. There's just not enough hands to serve the needs of the business. If we look at the business-led self-service, that is just absolutely totally ungoverned. And in this day and age where where everyone's so worried about governance, I would strongly dissuade you from taking that approach. I think you're just waiting for a data breach to happen, and you're waiting, and you will definitely lose control of what's in your environment. And it's for that reason that I think most of my customers and most of my colleagues and friends in the industry are typically heading towards the middle road there, the IT managed self-service BI. And so this allows a good amount of governance on the data, while allowing end users to actually create their own reports, or maybe power users within the different business units to do so. As I said, most organizations are going for that. So if we look at content management, to wrap up, it's important to plan your workspaces and therefore your apps. So too many workspaces or apps will get confusing for end users, and too few are going to have an impact on the security considerations. So that is really important. As I previously mentioned, planning your workspaces is one of the hardest things to get right in an organization. But if you understand all the things that have an impact on how you structure your workspaces, it will be easier for your organization. And also, just as a final side note, most people who have played with Power BI will notice you get your workspace or my workspace. This is only for testing. Please do not ever consider that as part of an organizational solution towards reporting. And as you'll notice, it's been well locked down over the years, and only you as an individual can see what's in your workspace, and you can't share anything from there. So just pointing that out for anyone who may be brand new to Power BI, to keep that in mind. I strongly recommend that you devise a business process for publishing content, that you keep a register of organizational reports or something like Purview or another data cataloging tool to do so. And in my opinion, we should be encouraging super users to create content because that unbottlenecks the organization. But we should definitely be incentivizing them to follow the rules. So the business process, which you've defined 2 bullet points above, needs to be enforced within your organization. If you create a process which is then not enforced, you might as well not have a process, because it won't happen. So there's various different ways to do that, but that will be depending on your organization and the politics within your organization. All right, so just other things to consider, other considerations is, within especially large organizations, how do you go about deploying Power BI desktop? These are things that you've got to think about. Is it done automatically? Do users have to request access, et cetera, et cetera? Again, different for every organization I work with. You've got administration of users and licenses, which is not insignificant in a large organization. So there's different approaches to making that easier for IT and for the end users, but it's something you need to give thought to for your organization. And then I'll briefly mention data-only workspaces. Now, this is an entire session in itself to talk about what the benefits of these are, but something to consider is separating your data from your reports. And so data-only workspaces are, and there's multiple different ways that people combine these, but at a very high level, it's workspaces that contain all the data. So especially now with Fabric and having warehouses and lakehouses all of those one lake artifacts. You know, you should have all of that stuff in a workspace, probably as well with the semantic models that are going to be on top of that, and then have the actual reports that consume those semantic models sitting in other workspaces. Now, there's various reasons why this is a good idea, and does appear to be becoming an industry standard, or at least what most people are considering best practice. But unfortunately, I don't have the time in this session to get into detail as to what the pros and cons and the different considerations in that space are. But please, if you are brand new to the space, do consider having data-only workspaces. So in summary, collaborate with the business on user experience before going too far. I've had too many instances over the years of going into organizations where they have not planned properly at the start, and then the users have started complaining that it's too noisy. They don't know what's going on. It's not a great experience. And when your end users no longer want to use your tool, your projects, or your capabilities of your team are dead in the water. And very importantly, and this will have an impact on all of that, is to ensure that you understand your organizational constraints before going too far. Define a governance and security strategy, and define your data storage strategy. Now, your strategy on that one may be that we're going to use a mix of import mode and direct lake and direct query, and that's fine, as long as the strategy or the decision points around that are clearly outlined, and that everybody's aware of what the limitations of the different storage modes may be. And deploy incrementally and test the success. I think that's how most projects happen these days anyway. But yeah. And if you're uncertain, well, use a recognized consultant to come and help you with all of the above.